Today's webcast, brought to you by the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, or KTDRR, at American Institutes for Research. As you know, the Center on KTDRR is funded by NIDLR. I'm Joanne Stark at the Austin office of American Institutes for Research, and I want to thank my colleague, Shoshana Rabinovsky, who is helping today with the logistics. In today's webcast, Bobby Silverstein will share information on contacting policymakers and their staff and how to request and prepare for meeting with them. This is in preparation for the in-person workshop that will take place next month on April 25th following the NARTEC conference. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Bobby Silverstein, who is Principal and Government Relations Legislative Expert with Powers, Pyle, Sutter, and Burville in Washington, D.C. His practice areas are disability and rehabilitation, government relations and public policy, and healthcare policy and advocacy. Now let's get started. Bobby?
Thank you very much, Joanne. I'm going to do a little bit more in-depth intro and then ask each of the 7 folks who are participating in the webinar to just a brief description of who you are, what you do, and kind of why you're interested in this issue. I spent more than a decade on Capitol Hill, both on the House side and the Senate side. On the Senate side, I was the staff director and chief counsel to the Senate Subcommittee on Disability Policy when it was chaired by Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa. I had the incredible honor and privilege of working in the House and the Senate on 20 bills that were all enacted into law dealing with disability policy, ranging from the early intervention program for infants and toddlers with disabilities to the TEC Act, to the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, to the multiple reauthorizations of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Rehabilitation Act, and also worked on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I was the behind-the-scenes architect doing the negotiations with the House, with the business and disability community on the ADA. After I left, a colleague of ours, Justin Dart, who some of you may know, others may not. He was known as the Gandhi or the Martin Luther King Jr. of the disability rights movement. When I told him I was leaving, he said to me, and I said, I'm not sure what I'm doing, and he said, excuse me, you have to continue working in the disability field. And I said, Justin, you're a guy who believes in empowerment and individual choice. I said, well, in your case, you don't have any. We taught you, you had learned over the 10, 12 years on Capitol Hill, you have a responsibility to give back, to teach others what you've learned in terms of disability policy, how to educate policymakers, how to be an effective advocate. And so over the years, I've developed comprehensive hour-long, day-long, half-day, day-long, 2-day training on how to be disability policy change agents. And also working specifically with folks like researchers who want to outreach to policymakers to share the knowledge that they've gained to help inform the policymaking process. I've been to virtually every state in the country doing training. And so it's, again, a privilege that Joanne asked me to help in terms of do this webinar. I can tell you and be quite frank with you, the researchers who have testified before the various committees that I worked for, I was not very impressed. They read their materials, they were very academic, and they missed opportunities. and I assume Joanne had concerns and others that this wealth of knowledge needs to be communicated to a particular audience in a particular way, and how to improve that education process, that dissemination process. Thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to chatting with you on this webinar for the next hour. We are also going to be in person in April, and during that in-person time we're going to do a lot of interactive work to help facilitate that communication process, role-playing, and other things. If we could just take a brief moment for each of you to introduce yourself. We'll start with Jennifer.
Jennifer is not on the phone, so she'll need to introduce herself in the chat box. So maybe
okay, Lauren. Lauren.
Yeah.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Hi, I'm Lauren Smith. I'm the Knowledge Translation Associate for the RTC Rural, which is part of the Rural Institute at the University of Montana.
In 1986, I worked for Pat Williams from Montana, and we earmarked this program for rural, and I think we might have even directed it to go to Montana. Welcome.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah, so I probably won't be a person who's directly communicating with policymakers, but one of the things, I work with all of our researchers, and I'm just really interested in learning how I can better help them communicate and what kind of different materials I can help produce that will help facilitate better communication.
Okay, well, Lauren, I would like to say that the slides are absolutely stealable. They are not copyrighted, and one of the purposes of my presentation is to train trainers so that you can share this information with others. So if steal away, borrow, take, don't have to use my name. If you want to give presentations to your colleagues, that's great.
All right, thank you.
Linda?
Hi, I'm Linda Ehrlich-Jones. I'm the Assistant Director for the Center for Rehabilitation Outcomes Research at the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab in Chicago, and I am responsible for the knowledge translation activities for an RRTC on employment for people with physical disabilities.
Great.
I have been to go ahead.
Go ahead, Linda. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say I've been to Capitol Hill for other reasons, sometimes more successful than others, so I'm anxious to hear what you have to share.
Great. Sarah B.?
Yeah, hi, this is Sarah. So I'm Sarah Bogie. I work at the STATS RRTC, which is at the Institute on Disability at the University of New Hampshire, and I'm a policy analyst, and one of my primary responsibilities is for our knowledge translation efforts. So I'm really looking forward to hear any tips throughout this webinar. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sarah R. Ruiz.
Hi, this is Sarah Ruiz. I'm a program officer at NIDLR, and my portfolio includes some of our health policy grantees, which is why I'm joining this call. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Toby?
Hi, I'm Toby Frymark, and I'm with the American Speech Language Hearing Association.
Hi. Meredith?
Hi, I'm Meredith Repke. I work with Lauren Smith at RTC Rural at the University of Montana. I actually am a pretty recent hire over there, so I'm hoping to just kind of be a fly on the wall through this process and absorb as much as possible.
Great. And did Jennifer join us, or is she? Jennifer, I don't see her in the chat room, or are you on the phone now? Okay. If not, let's get started.
She does, Bobby. She did introduce herself. She's a senior fellow at the University of Washington and a current health and aging policy fellow. This year, she's lucky to work for both a county and state policy department and is working on a federal project with SAMHSA. So it's good to hear from her colleagues, Lauren and Meredith. So
Great.
There you go.
Great. And Joanne, jump in if I seem to be moving from slide to slide and not pushing the button. I hope to be able to do both, but just in case.
Will do. Thanks.
Very helpful. Thank you. So in terms of what we're doing here, there's two kinds of issues, issues impacting individuals and issues impacting a lot of folks. And issues impacting a lot of folks often have public policy implications. To me, what is public policy? It's policy that proscribes inappropriate behavior, prescribes appropriate behavior, and provides program supports to enhance opportunities for folks. So it's our focus here is clearly on the public policy making process. And as members of the public, we all have a responsibility as citizens to educate policymakers so that they can make informed choices. Now, researchers play a particularly critical role in educating policymakers. First of all, it's critical for policymakers to know the context in which one operates. What are the outstanding issues? In our case, issues impacting people with disabilities and their families. What is the evidence, the information that the data that will help inform the policymaking process, including identify and narrowing the notion of what is a legitimate issue, what is a legitimate problem. Research can play a key role in problem identification and issue clarification, narrowing the issues, defining the issues. Research plays a key role in of considering alternative policy options for addressing the problems and the issues. Research is critical in terms of identifying cost implications. Research is critical in terms of return on investment as to whether or not particular options are cost effective. And then research is critical in terms of actual implementation, because oftentimes policymakers have to figure out whether or not the policy needs to be changed, or there needs to be more oversight or changes in terms of implementation strategies. And again, research can play a critical role in helping policymakers determine whether it's a policy that needs to be refined or different implementation strategies need to be addressed, like what kind of finance systems, what kind of reimbursement of providers, are there certain state or local plans that are required, are there service coordination requirements, are there issues in terms of due process protections, is there privacy, confidentiality provisions. That's the kind of implementation issues. And in each case, researchers can and should play a critical role in helping inform the process for the policymakers. I'm going to move to the next slide. So the purpose of my presentation today is help identify who your policymakers are, both at the federal and state level now, Identify appropriate staffers, because oftentimes staffers play a key role in the policymaking process. And then help you all inform, educate policymakers, whether it's through a visit, whether it's through a correspondence or actual live testimony, to enhance your communication skills of your research, the knowledge translation to this particular audience, that is policymakers. Now, one of the things that, this is the second year we're doing this, and we did a needs assessment last time before we put together the presentation. And one of the interesting things is that a number of grantees were saying, we don't even know how to identify the federal or state policymakers. We don't know who they are to share, to translate and communicate our research. And so we've added a couple of slides to make that easier. If you don't know who your member of Congress is, there's it's like an 800 number, it's just a 202 number. You press 0 and an operator will come on the phone. They'll ask you what your zip code is, and they will tell you who your member of Congress is and give you information on how to contact them. If you're web savvy and you don't want to make a phone call, there's a website which does the exact same thing on the House and separately on the Senate side. Again, I'm going to repeat what Joanne said. Hopefully I'm not going to be talking for the next hour. Hopefully there will be questions, dialogue. So again, repeating what Joanne, chime in with a question or a comment at any point. The next slide does the same thing for state legislators. Helps you identify who your state legislators are. Now, in terms of the way things actually work on Capitol Hill, and this is from the perspective not of a former member of Congress, but from a former staffer, we play a critical role. And as researchers, 95% of your effectiveness will be working with staffers, not necessarily members of Congress, unless you are formally asked to testify, or it's a particularly critical issue for that member. But to a large extent, you will be interacting, educating staffers. Oftentimes, they're very young unless they're committee staffers, and they come and go. Oftentimes, short 2 or 3 year tenure. You educate somebody, they leave, and you have to start all over again. And in a typical office at the federal level, you'll have interns, you'll have a receptionist, you'll have ledge correspondents who respond to inquiries by constituents, a ledge assistant who will have 1, 2, 3, or in the House side, maybe 10 areas of responsibility for expertise. Then you'll have a legislative director who oversees the policy, and a chief of staff, we call it administrative assistant, an AA. Oftentimes an AA is also known as a secretary, but on Capitol Hill, the AA is the #1 person. He or she does the politics as well as the policy and keeps the office running. Now on the House side, there are many fewer staffers than on the Senate side. And as I said, on the House side, a particular staffer may have responsibility for 10, 15, 20 programs. So they are spread thin, and they are just absolutely craving information from knowledgeable experts to help them help their member of Congress. On the Senate side, there are many, many more staffers, and their responsibilities is often much more limited, and therefore they will have a higher degree of expertise. Now that's the personal office. You also have committee offices, committees, and that's where all the business of Congress, or most of the business of Congress, occurs. So members of Congress may be a member of several committees. On the Senate side, there'll be members of even more committees. And then you'll have a chair and a ranking member of each committee, and that's where all the action is. That's where all the policy is made. And if you can get to a staff director, chief counsel, majority, minority, and work with them, you're making a lot of progress. You want to educate your member of Congress, but you really want to educate the committee staffers in terms of various issues, because that's where the policy is actually considered. Now, in a local office, in a personal office, if you just make a cold phone call, the receptionist is going to give you to the person with least power and authority. They will try to get you to an intern. They'll try to get you to the ledge correspondent rather than the legislative assistant or the ledge director. That's just the reality. So your job, if you want to translate knowledge and share your research, is to try to get to the policymaking staff who are in the personal office, the legislative assistant or the legislative director, or at the committee staff to get to the correct professional staff rather than the receptionist in the committee. Now that's a hard job. The receptionist's task is to keep you away, I'm being facetious, but keep you away from bothering the professional staff. And again, I'm being facetious here to make a point. And that point is that the professional staff are incredibly busy, and the House side, they've got so much that on their plate that they only want to talk to people who they think will help inform them, who will truly help them so that they can help their boss. And so your job is to make a pitch to communicate your credibility, that you're a big shot in the field, that you're a person with true knowledge and information that will help inform the policymaker. So we're not going to take the time now. We don't have the time, but in Virginia in April, we are going to spend 20 minutes on how to do a pitch, how to get beyond the receptionist and get to the professional staffer. We don't have the time to do that now. But are there any questions about that before we proceed? You want to get to the right people to translate the knowledge, but the reality is going to take an impressive pitch to get beyond the receptionist. That's just the reality of how the Hill works. People are so busy, so overwhelmed with people who want to talk to them that they have to figure out a way of screening. And you've got to try to figure out a pitch to get through that screen. If you're going to try to schedule a visit, try to meet with the member, great. Again, that's not easy, but the more gravitas, the more impressive the people, your credentials are, the greater the chance of meeting with the actual member or a staffer. Be very flexible and recognize that the reality is that a typical meeting is 10 minutes long. If you get 30, you're just doing something right. So you've got to fine-tune your presentation, recognizing that in most cases it may be a maximum of 10 minutes to meet with the staffer or the member. Now, if you do get to that meeting, then you've got to beware of filibusters. Unless you are very impressive in terms of communicating what it is that you have for the member or the staffer in terms of substantive knowledge, they're going to want to just chit-chat. They don't want to, they want to get information, but they don't want people to ask them where their members stand, because that means that by definition, some people will not like you because you're taking the position that is inconsistent with your approach. But again, as a researcher, you're probably more likely to be there to try to educate and inform rather than try to influence to adopt a particular position. That might be more in terms of what we will generically refer to as lobbying. But again, if you come in on a personal basis, not as a representative of the grant, you can certainly do your lobbying. But if you're there in terms of the program that you work for, you're there as educators to help inform the policymaking process.
I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Bobby, and just remind everyone that we have a special session at the workshop just discussing all these issues related to lobbying and not lobbying.
Yep, great. In terms of describing the purpose of your meeting, the topic area, how do you do your introductions when you start your meeting? Some people just introduce themselves, and they don't ask the question is, why am I doing this introduction? What can I accomplish? What can I achieve in terms of knowledge translation based on how I introduce myself? Well, again, we're going to practice this in April. We're making the pitch on who you are, because the goal of the first minute is to make the person, the staffer or the member, want to listen to what you have to say. What's your credibility? Who are you? What's your stature? Should I listen to you? And it could be your credentials. It could be the university that you work for. It could be the fact that your next-door neighbor is the best friend of the member of Congress or the staffer. You've got to just figure out how to get their attention and keep it and enhance your own status and credibility. You want to limit the agenda items that you're talking about, and you want to explain the subject matter of the meeting in a soundbite which piques their interest and curiosity. This is a big deal. Think about what kind of toothpaste you buy, what car you drive, what car you buy or lease. Think about where you purchase your clothes. All this is influenced by Madison Avenue and how they pitch certain things. You need to learn how to have a phrase that is going to get to their heart and soul, get to their head, that really piques their interest. And to the extent that the research you're doing affects legislation that is pending and they happen to be on the committee of jurisdiction in terms of immediacy of the bill and relevance, that's your pitch. But you've got to work on that. You just don't go to a meeting and start talking. The topic sentence, the first sentence in a book, think about all these things. This is a big deal, and again, in Washington, we're going to practice this extensively in terms of the pitch, the sound bite. Think about, the 30-second ads for when members are running. They're all done with intent to try to influence and gain your attention. And you have that responsibility. Just because you're doing good research, sound research, important research, relevant research, that doesn't matter. They're seeing 50 people in a day, and you're just one of those 50. And if you can't make a presentation that is unique, that stands out amongst those 50, people are going to fall asleep. Or they're going to say, thank you for sharing, and then when they leave, you're going to take whatever you leave back and put it in the garbage pail, because there's not a whole lot of room for staffers to file stuff. Electronically, obviously, unlimited, but not hard information. So you've got to really practice this pitch. And again, researchers don't think of themselves as marketers, but as knowledge translators, you sure as hell have to think of yourself as marketers and figure out those pitches. If you come to a meeting with a bunch of folks, you've got to figure out who's the best person to speak. Then you have to do something else that researchers, again, in my experience, don't do, because they think they've got hard data. Well, hard data is yes, but what does the data deal with? It deals with, in our area, the impact on people with disabilities and their lives. It affects the families. It affects the delivery of services for people with disabilities. In all cases, it's people with disabilities who are affected. There is research in terms of communication research that clearly says there's something in the brain that happens when you can make an emotional attachment. You've got to get to their heart and soul before you get to their head. And you've got to figure out how to do that, how to present your research in terms of impact on people with disabilities and their lives, the lives of their families. And that, again, takes a lot of work to try to do that. But if I've learned one thing over my 50 years working in the field of disability policy, is you've got to take personal stories and then tie them to policy objectives. Introduce a personal issue, a way of getting to their heart before you identify and describe your research. How you frame the issue is so critical to get their attention. How is it relevant to bills that are pending? You've got to be able to do this. And that's the next point, how the research addresses the issue. Why is your research important? Does it help explain different policy options? Does it help explain the return on investment that in the era of limited resources that we need to show cost effectiveness? And not only return on investment, but again, that's the cost and effectiveness. People need to know what the costs are. So what are the alternative policy options? Research can help tell you that. Is there a return on investment? Research can help. What are the costs? and why is this policy issue important? That's all the things that research can address. Now, how do you describe your research findings and conclusions? What format do you use? How do you relay this format? These were some of the questions that were asked ahead of this, raised ahead of this webinar. Well, again, we've got to figure out who the audience is to answer that question. The audience are staffers and members who are overwhelmed with people trying to demand of their time, of their attention, try to get them to embrace their policy options, lobbyists. You've got all these demands. So, what format? How do you relay information? You've got to figure out the fact. Another thing is they don't have a place to store things. So that means electronic version. So what does a staffer do? What are the typical tasks a staffer does? The staffer writes memos to the boss as to whether they should support a bill or not support a bill, whether they should attend a hearing or not on a particular issue, whether they should introduce an amendment or support an amendment or oppose an amendment, or do a speech in front of a group, or do a speech on the floor of the United States Senate. These are all the things that staffers help members do. So, you've got to put your information in a format that is helpful. And I used to basically say to the people, the researchers, those trying to educate me, those trying to lobby me when I was a staffer, remember, I steal for a living. And if you put it in a format where I can cut and paste, you have a major advantage. If you want some research in a committee report is going to be meaning for you a paragraph. You need to provide, if you're going to provide stuff in relay findings in research and you want it to be shared in a committee report, you have to figure out how to do it in a paragraph. If you want something, your research to be in a floor statement, you have to realize that the floor statement is probably going to be 2 or 3 minutes long or 4 minutes, and how does it fit in? But you've got to write it in a way that the staffer can cut and paste it. If you know the member is going to be giving a key speech in front of a group, and you want your research in the speech, you've got to figure out, talk to the people the communication people, of how you write a speech. In a nutshell, it's going to be 1 or 2 pages long. It's going to be electronic. It's going to allow you to steal parts of your document that you cut and paste. You want to provide a policy context. You want to provide links, so if the member or the staffer wants to follow up on their own, they don't have to do work. You've done the work for them, so at the end you'll provide resources, links, and explain what each link is and what it does. So that's your job if you want to have your research being considered. You have to look at this from the perspective of the user of the research. You want to
Bobby,
engage?
I've got a question from Jennifer. She's the one that's online.
Yeah.
Her question is, how can you effectively continue a relationship with a staffer or with an office and be seen as a reliable source on a subject matter or a subject matter expert so that you can continue to seem relevant and so it doesn't seem like you're hounding or badgering?
Okay, that's a great question because the answer is trust. Trust, 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 trust. When I do my training, I have the top 10 tips. And tip 8 is develop a trust relationship. And then I say tips 1 through 7, tip 9 and 10, you can ignore it or do them in a half-ass way. But if you do 8 well, you could have an ongoing relationship. It's trust. That means you're providing a full set of information. If there are other people who have come to different conclusions, share those. But you have to say to yourself, am I credible? Am I reliable? All the things that NIDLR expects of its researchers, you've got to communicate those to folks. And that you have to be immediately responsive. You've got to be able to, I used to, when I was not on Capitol Hill, before I went to Capitol Hill, I used to tell my secretary, if Jack Jennings calls, get me out of the bathroom, literally, because he's the staff director of the Elementary and Secondary Education Subcommittee. If he doesn't get me then, he may never call me back, or I may speak to him 2 days after it's relevant. You've got to be timely. You have to be responsive. You have to be credible. You have to not try to be an advocate when you're a researcher. Be an advocate when you're an advocate. Let your research speak for itself. Put it in usable form. That's the way you get the credibility. That's the way you get the trust. That's the way you develop the ongoing relationship. I kid and I say the following, which to me reflects a summary of what we just talked about. If I go to try to get a meeting, and I get a meeting, and I share stuff, that's great. You've reached the promised land of knowledge translation and education and informing policymakers when they call you. Your goal in a 5-minute meeting is not to communicate your research. Your goal is to develop the seeds for an ongoing trust relationship. So that's a great question, and that is the heart and the guts of what we're talking about. Any other questions before we proceed? In the course of your discussion with folks, you want to reiterate the key themes from your research. You can ask if they've reviewed other research that either supports or refutes your conclusions. And then if there are those that are different, give an opportunity to follow up with additional information. And again, this is to follow up the question, offer to serve as an expert on the issue, including serving as an expert witness. If you think that you can make a difference in 10 minutes with a staffer, you're wrong. The purpose of that meeting, sure, it is in part to communicate your research, but the primary purpose is to gain the trust and then explicitly offer to be the expert on a particular issue. And follow up with an email offering to provide that, offering additional links to other research, other information that they can use. Remember, you got busy staffers who are overwhelmed with information and data. They're trying to have people help them sort through the data. You as a researcher can help do that. They're trying to figure out policy options. Research can help do that. cost of things, research can do that, return on investment, all these things that they are interested in, you've got to be saying to yourself, before you set the meeting up, look at it from their perspective. How can you help them do their job to protect and promote their boss? And if you meet with the boss, how can you get them to understand the nuances of an issue? They will know the black and white issues because from the political folks, your job as a researcher is to help them understand the nuances of issues. I'm done. I got a thank you. I think you send a thank you, and that's it. That's the quick and dirty. We're going to spend multiple hours, have many role plays, get into a lot of these issues in more depth. But do folks have any additional questions?
I did ask everybody to think about some questions before you came today because you can tell Bobby like the kind of people that you're wanting to get in touch with, the kinds of information that you have to share. If you've been thinking about some things that you'd like to do, bring up those ideas now, and then next month Bobby may be able to give you some better answers than just off the cuff today. So hopefully people took that seriously and brought some questions. I noticed the people that are not here didn't email me the questions, which I had suggested they do. But I hope some of you do have some questions that you can share with Bobby. We do have a little time to answer them and get started with them. Okay. The best way for Bobby to be able to tailor the workshop to respond to everybody's needs is to give him that information ahead of time. So even if it's not today, if we can get that information to him early enough, he'll be able to think about it and give you some directions that will be, like he said, tailored to what it is you want to do.
Now, let me ask you all a question. Is there anything that I said today in terms of knowledge translation that is not exactly what you do for other audiences? Is there anything that is really unique? The essence of effective knowledge translation is know who your audience is. And the only thing that I think that may be not different but is helpful in this process is to understand the incredible pressures, time pressures and otherwise, that staffers and members are under, and to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. But the essence of what I said, hopefully, is, oh, that's exactly the essence of effective knowledge translation. Any comments?
I'm sure everybody's thinking about it. I'll just go ahead and throw it out there that you're exactly right. If you don't know your audience and you don't approach the audience appropriately and with the kind of information that they're looking for and in the format they need, then you're not going to get anywhere. I think one of the things we've always heard about policy people is that they need that information when they need it. So it's not that helpful to bring them something that's interesting, but if they're actually working on a topic, that's when they're going to say, who was that professor that came in and shared something about this topic? So that's what Bobby was saying. You want them to think of you and know that you're the person that can answer that question at the time they have that need.
Right. So that is your primary goal in any meeting or any dialogue or any interaction, is to develop that trust relationship so that they know you're the go-to person.
Hi, this is
Bobby.
Linda. Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. It's fine.
Well, somebody start.
So this is Linda. So this brings to mind, should we do some kind of homework in terms of knowing what committees our legislators are on and what certain policies or certain bills or things that they're working on before we make an appointment?
Absolutely. You want planned spontaneity. You want to be spontaneous when you meet, but everything should be planned. This should be strategic planning 101. And that requires knowing who your audience is, which means knowing what committees they're on, knowing their positions on certain issues. I mean, I can take any issue and I can describe it in 10 different ways, depending on who my audience is. And I can do it without being disingenuous, because I can highlight different issues or frame it in a different way. And that's again, that's that pitch that I was talking about, that first sentence, that how you describe who you are or why you're there. That will depend on who they are, who the audience is, how old the staffer is. This needs to be researched.
Thank you.
We had another question.
Yeah, this is Lauren. I was just wondering about if you're not able to do an in-person meeting and you just wanted to email, say, a fact sheet or something. How do you, who do you address that email to? And are you trying to target the staffer? Or is it just like the office?
You're trying to target the staffer who has jurisdiction over that. And again, you've got to figure out in the subject line what is the sex, drug, and rock and roll that is going to get their attention, because they will get 300 emails a day. How do you put something in that subject line that says, whoa, this is interesting, I'm going to check this out? How do you have your first sentence in your email so that you keep that person's attention? Whether it's the credibility of the person, hi, I'm Dr. blah, 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 representing, in other cases, 6,000 of your constituents, but as a researcher you may say that you are one of the world's experts on XYZ. You could do it that way. You could do it, I understand that a bill that the member is sponsoring is before Congress, and I have research that could help help inform the policymaker. You've got to figure out that first sentence as well as what's in the subject line, because I remember when I was on the Hill, I would literally get 300-400 emails a day. How do you sort through them? If the subject lines didn't look interesting, or I didn't know the person, or there was no way of seeing that this was an important person, and it may well be in the subject line, University of Montana. Might be something that you send to your member of Congress from Montana. That might be something in the subject line that everybody's going to have to read. You've got to be strategic.
Thank you.
We do have a few more minutes. If we can get one other question, we could probably get that addressed. And if not, we can go ahead and wrap things up. And I'll ask everybody, again, to think about things to bring with you to the actual workshop next month, so that we can address things that are really relevant to you and the kinds of information you're trying to share. Bobby, you have anything you want to wrap up with?
No, I just think, again, the critical question that was asked is the critical issue, is ongoing relationships. That is your goal, so that you can share your research on an ongoing basis. and you have to develop that trust relationship and figure out what that means. That's my major takeaway. The other takeaway is hopefully very little of what I said is new. Because oftentimes what people say is, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. It's members of Congress. It's totally different. It really isn't.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for sharing this information, Bobby, and thanks everyone for coming today. We did record it so that those who couldn't make it today will be able to listen to this if they'd like to. And again, think about what you'd like to get out of this workshop next month, specific things that would be helpful to you and the information that you want to share, and the kinds of policies that you'd like to see impact. And we'll be following up with everybody. If you have any questions, please go ahead and send them to me by email. You've got my email address, and I'll follow this up with a little reminder. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month in Washington after the NARTEC conference. Thank you.